And we are learning L'schus or for Shlema for Harav Yosef Yitzchak ben Sima Chasya, and of course schus for world peace, specifically for peace to come to the very troubled region, and for the Eibishter to protect all of our fellow brothers and sisters and all of the citizens in the war-torn region in the Ukraine. And after our Sikha today, we will say Tehillim together and give tzedakah together as a group. And I know that everybody feels the same way, like what can we do? And certainly we can learn Torah, give tzedakah, and daven. And we must do no less. Pekudei Beis, Chelek Tezayin, Seif Aleph. Amru Chazal, our sages taught, ala pasuk, on the first pasuk of this week's parsha, which is Eila Pekudei HaMishkan, Mishkan Edus. These are the accounts of the Mishkan of testimony, etc. Shemashanemar Mishkan Shnei Pa'amim. So if you have the Chumash in front of you and you look at the pasuk, the word Mishkan appears twice. It's an alliteration. And our Chachamim taught that it's Remez LaMikdash Shenis Mashkin B'Shnei Churvanim. That this is an allusion to the temple, to the Beis HaMikdash, that was taken as collateral in both of the times that it was destroyed, with both destructions, Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash. The Einam Muvan, K'may Shehukshu Mefarshim, and this is not so easily understood, as has been questioned by various commentators. Mibein shtei hapa'amim shenemar mishkan hari rak achas miyuteres. Of the two times that the pasuk says the word mishkan, only one is extraneous, only one is superfluous. Shari mishkan pam achas nitzrach legufel, because saying the word mishkan once is necessary for the content of the pasuk. After all, it's the subject about which the verse is speaking. V'imkein. And so if only one of the instances of the word mishkan is extra, so how can you then turn around and say that the twice mentioned word mishkan is an allusion to the two Batei Mikdash that were destroyed? It would seem that one is simply speaking about the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the Midbar, in the desert, and one could be an allusion to something else. But how can both words, one of which is necessary for the construct of the sentence, be an allusion to another Beis HaMikdash? Umizeh gufa muchach, and from this itself, it's proven shahalimur hanal mishkan, that the above mentioned teaching that our sages taught us concerning the words mishkan, that the word mishkan is doubled one time followed by a second time, einai drash miutara dikra. It's not simply a commentary expounding on extra word in the verse. Hu remes b'lashon Rashi. It's simply an allusion, as Rashi explained, b'kefel tevas mishkan, in the fact that the word is repeated shenis mashkin, that we learned something else from the word mishkan, because mishkan in its purest form, certainly as we use it, is a reference to the tabernacle, the shul that Hashem told Bnei Yisrael to build in the Midbar while they were still in the desert. But what Rashi is telling us is that the fact that it's twice repeated in this pasuk is an allusion to a secondary meaning, and that the word mishkan is also etymologically linked to the word shenis mashkin, which means it was given as collateral. Like in Israel, you hear people speaking all the time about their mashkanta. So it's the same word, which is their mortgage, v'hainu, meaning shekasuv zeh medaber oides hamishkan behetem leperish hapasha da hamishkan mishkan. This means that the pasuk is speaking simply about the mishkan. Elo shebiyachad zeh, But along with that, Mirames Haloshon Mishkan al Inyan Hamashkain. But in addition to the fact that this is a reference to the Mishkan, the actual Mishkan, the literal Mishkan, it also alludes to the idea of a mashkain, a collateral. The Mishkan, Shnei Pamim Moira ala Mashkan shel Shnei HaMikdashos. But the fact that this word is repeated twice in the first pasuk of our parsha is an allusion to the fact that the two Mikdashos were taken by Hashem as collateral. And we'll return to that idea. Beis, HaSeforno Bier, the Mepharish, the commentator called the Sefornim, explains, Sha'apasuk ele Pekudei HaMishkan, that this pasuk that we're looking at, these are the accounts of the Mishkan, Mabia es goidel ma'alasam shel chelkei ukli HaMishkan, actually expresses something about the greatness, the great stature of the components of the Mishkan and the vestments, the kelim in the Mishkan. Dimitam zeh, and because there was such great holiness attached to the components of the Mishkan, loy nifsadu, they were not lost. K'may amru Chazal, like Chazal taught us in the Gemara, Shema Taima Abad, lest you say that it was lost, the Mishkan was lost. Talmud Leimar, our pasuk teach, not this pasuk, a pasuk in Truma teaches, Atse Shitim Oimdim, the cedar would stand, the cedar tree stand, Sha'oimdim La'ad Ul'ome Elamim, that the cedars, meaning the material from which, the raw material from which the walls of the Mishkan were fashioned, stand forever and ever. V'yaser mizu, and even more than that, Loi nafal davar lehem bi'ada evim. And we also know about the components of the Mishkan that none of those components fell into the hands of the enemies. V'akasav mefarik es prate hamayles, and our pasuk actually delineates the many exalted aspects of the Mishkan. And because of these properties, because of these characteristics of the Mishkan was deserving and worthy of being eternal and not falling in the hands of our enemies. What does the pasuk tell us? Ele Pekudei HaMishkan, Mishkan HaEdus. These are the accounts of the Mishkan of testimony. And the Torah goes on to say, Asher Pukad al Pi Moshe, that were drawn up by Moshe's orders. Avodas HaLevim, for the work of the Levim, Biad Isamar, under the direction of Isamar, Ben Aaron HaKayin, the son of Aaron the Kayin. Asher B'schus Kol HaMailas Halalu, because of all of these amazing characteristics, therefore Hashem's presence rested in the hands of these exalted people who fashioned the Mishkan, and it did not fall into the hands of the enemies. Masha Enkin, a contradistinction, Mikdash Rishon, the first of the Batei Mikdash. Shebai loy hayu kol hamaylas halalu, that Mikdash did not have these same characteristics. And although Hashem Shechina rested in the first Beis Hamikdash, but components of the Beis Hamikdash were lost, and at the end, all of it fell into the hands of the enemies. And in like fashion, but even more so, b'Mikdash Sheni, in the second Beis Hamikdash. There weren't any of these above mentioned distinctions. The Hashem Shechina did not rest there, and it fell into it in its entirety into the hands of the enemies. And we might say that the source for this teaching, at least the general teaching, Maimer Chazal b'Gemara, is something that our sages taught in the Gemara and Gemara Saita, Shaloi Sholtu Soinehem b'Maaseh Yedei Moshe, that our enemies could not hold sway, they could not be sovereign over the work of Moshe's hands. Something that Moshe created, that Moshe fashioned, that Moshe built, could not fall to the enemies. So from when the first mikdash was built, Nignas Ayalmoyed, Krashav, Krasa, Bricha, Vamuda, Badana, Velinaflu Biata Evim. So as soon as the first mikdash was built, all of the components of the Mishkan of the Ayalmoyed were hidden away in a miraculous way. All of it, the walls, the poles, the amudim, the pillars, the adanim, the silver bases, all of it was hidden away. And upon this teaching in the Gemara is based the explanation of the sages on this pasuk, the first pasuk of our parsha, that because the Mishkan was created and fashioned upon the instruction of Moshe, that is why it was eternal, and all of its components are eternal. Gimel. Mala Yisei Razu Shebe Mishkan ala Mikdashos hi mitzat pshat hamikra. What is distinctive concerning the Mishkan over the Batei Mikdash is something that we learn from the pshat of this pasuk, Hainu Shebe Pashtos, meaning simply speaking, begoloi, in a revealed fashion, Dafka HaMishkan Hu Nitzchi. It is specifically the Mishkan that is eternal, because it was fashioned by Moshe. In contradistinction to the Batei Mikdash that fell into the hands of our enemies and were destroyed. Aval mitzad haremesh bekasov. But if you're looking at the pasuk on the next level of interpretation, what's alluded in the pasuk, if you're looking more into the internal strata of this concept, gam hamikdashos hein nitzchim. The Batei Mikdash are also eternal. Ubazen is Yashva Hatmiya Hagdoilosh Hakasav Mirames al Churban Beis Hamikdash V'Tebas Mishkan Shenis Mashkin. And once we understand that the Batei Mikdash also have an eternal quality, which the Rebbe is going to unfurl for us, then this can reconcile the great wonder of us being taught that the Mikdash, the Batei Mikdash, would be alluded to in a word Mishkan, which is etymologically related to the word Shenis Mashkin, that was taken away as collateral. Why is this a big wonder? Because in Yanei Shel Mashkin, Eina Shehachafet Shenis Mashkin Nevad Mi Ba'alov Va'ovel Rishusay Shel Hamal V'Legamre. Because how does collateral work? It's something that you put up for a temporary amount of time, against which you borrow money. But it's not that when you give something away for collateral, it's completely lost to you, and it now becomes the ownership of the person who's loaning you the money. That's not how collateral works. It's rather that it belongs to the loaner for a transitory period of time. And at the end, this, whatever it is that was taken as collateral, is returned to the borrower. So the Rebbe says, and this is true concerning the mikdashes. Hachurban shahaya bahem ein perushay shemitziusam nizbatla legamrei chas v'shalom. When we talk about the Churban Beis Hamikdash, the first, Churban Beis Hamikdash, the second, we need to understand that it does not mean that it was completely destroyed. Chas v'shalom. Ela hadavar hu ba'efen shel mashkin bilvat. Although physically it was destroyed, although physically Yidden watched it burn, but eternally it is ours. and it was simply taken away as collateral. And the Rebbe asserts that at the end, it will be returned to us. The Beis Hamikdash Harishon, the Beis Hamikdash Hasheni, it exists. It's sequestered away, but it belongs to us. Dalet. The above mentioned way in which there's an eternal quality about the Mishkan that obscures even the Mikdashos. Hirak b'nagea lechelkei uklei Mishkan. Now here the Rebbe is going to parse this idea of eternity. And he's going to say that the way in which the Mishkan, the eternity of the Mishkan is greater than of the Batei Mikdash is specifically concerning the components of the Mishkan and the kelim, the vestments of the Mishkan. But when you speak about the holiness of the actual place, when you talk about Hashem resting his presence in that place, whether you're talking about the Mishkan or the Mikdash, Hare Matzinu Mala Shel Nitzchis b'Mikdash Dafka. When you look at it in terms of the place, then the Mikdash has a greater characteristic of eternity over the Mishkan. In the words of the Rambam, in the part of his Mishnah Torah, where he speaks about the laws surrounding the Batei Mikdash. So the Rambam says, Ukfar Nisparish b'Torah, and it was already explained in the Torah. Mishkan she'asa Moshe Rabbeinu v'haya lefi sha'a, the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu fashioned, which was temporary, v'chulei, kevan shenivna hamikdash b'Yerushalayim, nesru kol hamekaymes kulan livnais behen bayis laHashem. As opposed to the fact that when the Beis Hamikdash was built in Yerushalayim, at once it was forbidden in all other places in the world, including in Eretz Yisrael, to build a house for Hashem, ulahakriv behen korban, and to offer sacrifices, ve'ein sham bayis l'dayrei hadayres, and there is no home for God for all generations, ella b'Yerushalayim b'vad b'Har Moriah, with the exception of in Yerushalayim and specifically on Har HaMoriah v'chulei. Umevi al zegam es hakasuv, and the Rambam then bolsters his statement by bringing the pasuk from Tehillim, Zois menuchasi ade ad. This will be my resting place until eternity. The holiness of the space of the Mishkan was temporary. And this is reflected in the terminology of the pasuk. Hashem says, and I will accompany you in the tent. But the word tent is by definition a reference to something temporary, as opposed to uvayis l'dayrei hadayres, as opposed to the reference to the Beis Hamikdash, which talks about a bayis, a house, which is a reference to Hashras Hashchina b'kfiyus, to the resting place of Hashem's presence in a kfiyus on a constant basis. And this is Einai Ella b'Mikdash b'Yerushalayim. And the constancy of Hashem's resting is only in Yerushalayim. And so this is also reflected when you talk about in the negative, that Misha Nivna Beis Hamikdash, from when the Beis Hamikdash was built, Nasru Kol HaMekaymes Kulan Livnais. So at that moment, it became forbidden to build a house for Hashem in any other place. Via Seira Mizu, and even more. Bevinyan Hamikdash Harishon, with the building of the first Beis Hamikdash, it is not only that there was a novelty, that from that point on, there was established a constant place for Hashem to rest the Shechina. Ella hashras Hashchina nesesa az bepoel ba'ofen nitzchi. But at that time, that resting of Hashem Shechina, that place became something eternal. Kamaisha Pasuk HaRambam, like the Rambam Paskins, Shekedushas Hamikdash Rishalayim, Kedusha Rishayna Kitcha La'asid Labai, Lefi Shekedushas Hamikdash Rishalayim, Ipnei Hashchina Ushchina Eina Betela. The Rambam Paskins that when the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, the original Kedusha will be there, the Kedusha Rishayna. Why? Because the Kedusha of the Mikdash in Yerushalayim is due to the Shechina. And the Shechina is never obviated. The Shechina is inviolable. And from this it's understood that what was explained above, that from this allusion in the pasuk we learn that the Batei Mikdash are also eternal, just like the Mishkan. It's not only because the holiness of the place is never obviated, because in that respect, on the contrary, the Mikdash has a superlative quality over the Mishkan, and the Mikdash is the main thing, you could say, when we talk in general, historically, of the places where Hashem rested in Shechina, the Mikdash, outranks the Mishkan. But the Rebbe says, but it's more. But also we learn from our pasuk that even in the Batei Mikdash, yeshnai al kolponim me'ein inyan hanitzche shebechalkei ukli hamishkan. That even in the Mikdash, in the Batei Mikdash, that were not fashioned by Moshe, that at first glance they don't have the components and the kalim don't have the same eternity. But the Rebbe says, but we learn from the allusion of this pasuk, from the way that the reference to the Batei Mikdash is learned out from the second term Mishkan in this pasuk, that there is me'ain, there is somewhat of an eternity to the components of the Mikdash. Hey. So how do we understand this? Because earlier the Rebbe put out a binary that the Mishkan and the Mikdash were different. The Mishkan was built by Moshe, and everything that Moshe built is eternal, whereas the Mikdash, it was not like that. But now the Rebbe is saying, but because the Batei Mikdash are alluded to in this pasuk from the word Mishkan, it must mean that there is some parallel regarding not just the space of the Mikdash, but also the kalim and also the components of the Mikdash. And the Rebbe says we will be able to understand this by prefacing with a different Maimer Chazal. Lahaktim Maimer Chazal al pasuk, by looking at what the Chazal teaches in Gemara Megillah on the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh, Ki lo basem ad ata el hamenucha ve'el hanachla. You did not come until this time to the rest and to your inheritance, to your resting place and your inheritance. And Chazal teach, Menucha zu Shilai, that the word Menucha is a reference to Shilai, where the first Mishkan in Eretz Yisrael was set up. And Nachla zu Yerushalayim. And Nachla, the word inheritance, is an allusion to the Batei Mikdash in Yerushalayim. The Pashtos, simply speaking, Hatam Yerushalayim Dafka Nikres Nachala Veshila Nikres Menucha. The reason why Yerushalayim would be called your inheritance and Shila would be called your rest, and only your rest, because the term Nachala, your inheritance, again speaks to kfius, constancy, permanence, much more so than menucha, which means a resting place. One can rest also for a very temporary amount of time. So you could say, I'm going to my hotel room to rest. That's perfectly normal and tenable. But you wouldn't call your hotel room your inheritance. That would be your home. And therefore, Kevan she'ein sham bayis l'daria hadaris ela b'Yerushalayim nikreis Yerushalayim nachala. And because the only place where there will be a house for Hashem for all generations, for all eternity, is Yerushalayim. Therefore, Yerushalayim is called nachala. Aval ein tam zeh maspik. But the Rebbe says, but that's not enough of a reason. Why? Sharia kasov zeh, because this very pasuk from Re'eh, ki lo basem at ata ala menucha ve'lanachla, misparesh l'deya achas, is explained by, in a different way of understanding, by a different mefarish who's using a different reasoning, that menucha zu Yerushalayim. It's explained in the opposite way, that the word menucha in that pasuk refers to Yerushalayim, and nachala zu Shilai. And nachala is a reference to Shilai. Av shelachuli alma yesh b'Yerushalayim ma'ila yiser al Shilai. And this is even though everybody admits that Yerushalayim obscures Shilai. And still, there's a way of understanding the pasuk in Re'eh as the word nachala actually referring to Shilai. And because of this, we are forced to say, Shagam b'menucha yesh ma'ila b'yachas l'nachla. That the word menucha, that the concept of menucha, of rest, embodies some quality that is overriding even over the quality of nachla. V'hainu. This means shemenucha v'nachla him shnei suge ma'alei shonim v'yesh bazeh ma she'ein bazu. In the first interpretation, we understand menucha and nachla laid out for us in a hierarchical trajectory. One is higher than the other. But now the Rebbe is saying, no, when we look at the way that this very same pasuk is understood by other mefarshim, we have to conclude that both menucha, the concept of rest, and nachala, the concept of inheritance, are both very important categories that each boast their own characteristics, and one has what the other doesn't have. And it's not such a simple hierarchy. What is the explanation? How do we understand this? Amor, as we said, Hamayla Shabamishkan he Shechelke Uklei Hamishkan him Nitzchiyim. Okay, the great Maila of the Mishkan is that its components and its kelim are eternal. Aval Kimakim Lahashra Ashchina Lo Haya Mishkan Ela Lefisha. But as a place where Hashem would rest His presence, it was only temporary. It was a oihel. It was a tent. Ve'ilu hamikdash hu lehefach. And the mikdash is opposite. B'makayim hamikdash yeshna kedusha nitzchis. Eina betela. In terms of a place where Hashem would rest His presence, it's permanent. The Shechina eina betela. Aval etzem habinyan v'chalakav nifsadu. But the actual building, the structure itself and its components were lost. V'naflu b'dei ha'avim. And they fell into the hands of our enemies. Ushtei mailei sheinos elu mirumazais b'shnei hatayarim menucha v'nachla. And this difference between the Mishkan and the Mikdash is alluded to in these two terms, in these two descriptions, menucha and nachla. Because simply speaking, what's the difference between menucha and nachla? If you analyze it, if you break it down. Menucha, the Rebbe says, rest, mita'eres is matzav nafshei shel ha'adam, gavra. Menucha describes the person's situation, their emotional situation. So in halachic terminology, it's called gavra. It speaks to the person. She'ena b'matzav shel tiltul mimakam l'makam. Menucha describes a person who is not moving and schlepping things from place to place. Ubazeh kolul gam matzavam shel klei adam hamitaltalim yachad imay. And this also includes a person's things that they're schlepping from place to place to place. The Rebbe says, as we see practically, the things we have, they have a deep impact on us. We need our things. As we get older, we need our beds. We need our creature comforts. Not that we're like, princess with the P, but a person is affected by their things. And it's mashpia al das ha'adam, and it impacts our mood, it impacts our bandwidth. And in this respect, our things are more impactful, are more close to us than even our homes, than our domicile. Whereas the term nachal, inheritance, that describes the thing, the chefza. Okay, so the menucha describes the gavra, the person, and nachala describes chefza, the thing. In this place, hakarka, the real estate, your inheritance. And if you want to look very, very quickly in the second part of footnote 25, the Rebbe says, the Rebbe says in the Torah of Chasidus, it illuminates the difference between your clothing and your house. Your clothing is called makif hakarev, that which surrounds you, that is close to you, and the apartment or your house is called makif harachik, and they affect you in different ways. And through this, we can understand that the Mishkan Moshe, that components of which were made from the Mishkan that Moshe fashioned, Moshe Kasav Rambam, like the Rambam writes, Ubanu Sham Bayis, they built there a house, Ufarsu Urias HaMishkan Olav, and they spread the Urias, the tapestries of the Mishkan upon the house they built in Shiloh. Ma'alasehi Menucha. So this Mishkan Shiloh had the characteristic of resting. Its eternity is expressed in the components thereof and in the vestments. The things that travel with a person from place to place. And therefore, when they came to Shiloh in a permanent way, Nikra Hadavar Menucha. That's called resting. Hamitaeres Kanal is matzav nefesh adam. This described, as explained above, what they felt, their emotional situation. But when you're talking about the mikdash, that's its characteristic. Its great characteristic is not in its components and its kelim, but rather that this is the place that is always going to hold the holiness. And therefore it's called nachla. Hamitzayenes es tchunas hamakim, because that really signals something about the place rather than the thing. Actually, the place is the thing rather than what's being felt by the person. So it's chefza and not gavra. Vav. The explanation about the differences between the Mishkan and the Mikdash. On the one hand, Maise b'nei Adam, Nivraim, Mugbalim, Eina Yachal Lifoil as Inyan HaNitzchius. We have to understand that anything a human being does, a human being is a creation. By definition, a human being is limited, and therefore a human being cannot effect eternity. Eternity can only be affected by Hashem. So here's another component in the difference. that the aspects, the components of the Mikdash themselves were not eternal. Kiheim Beloshan Hazayah, because as the Zayah describes them, Binyana de Barnash, it is a building that was created by humans. Masha Enkein Kedushasei Hanitzchi Shel Makom HaMikdash Eina Inyan Hanifal Al Bnei Adam. But the holiness that is inherent and endemic and inviolable about the place of the Mikdash, that is not something that was affected by human beings. It flows, the constant eternal holiness flows from the fact that Hashem chose that place to rest his name on. The Rebbe already quoted this before, that the Kedusha of the Mishkan is because of the Shechina, and the Shechina, it will never be abnegated. This is to say, it is not the building that affected the holiness, nor the resting of Hashem's place. Building the actual structure of the Beis Hamikdash was only preparatory, in order that the place should be prepared for Hashem resting his presence. And that the resting of Hashem's presence should be in a manifest way. But the fact that Hashem's presence would rest there, the resting itself came from the fact that Hashem chose that place to rest, and therefore it is eternal. In contradistinction, Mishkan, when you talk about the Mishkan, lehefach, it's the opposite. Hashras Hashchina loy ba machmas b'chiras HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'makayim hamishkan l'shakit shmei sham. Hashem's resting his Shechina there did not come because Hashem chose that place specifically to rest his name there. Ela hasiba lazeh haisa asiyas hamishkan. In the case of the Mishkan, it was actually the construction of the Mishkan that pulled Hashem's Shechina down there. As we were commanded in the words of Asuli Mikdash, Va'al Yidei Zeh, and through your making me a Mikdash, V'shachanti b'seichem, I will rest among you. And when in that place the reason for Hashem's resting is abnegated, there's no more of a Asuli Mikdash, Batal HaMisufav. Then the effect is also abnegated, and there's no longer V'shachanti, that I will rest in that place. But when you speak about the components of the Mishkan and the Kalim, because they were made, they were fashioned through Moshe. Moshe, who Eved Hashem, Moshe is a servant of Hashem, Eved Ne'eman, a faithful servant. V'chol mitziusei shel Eved hi mitzius ha'adain. And the entire existence of a servant is, in actuality, the existence of the owner. Ubifrat al pi haperush, and especially in light of the explanation that Masha kana Eved kana Rabbi. So the Rashba in Kiddushin says that on the words, what a servant buys is really bought by the owner. Dahainu. So the Rashba explains it means it's not that a servant can actually buy something for himself, and through the agency of his purchase, his owner then acquires it. The Eved cannot own anything. Milachatchila, to begin with, he can't own anything. So anything he buys, lechatchila, belongs to his owner. So in the same way, Hare Kashem Shemaisa Yadav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nitzchim Heim. So since Moshe is an Eved Neman, so everything about Moshe is really godliness. It's really Elokus. It's Hashem. He owns nothing. He is nothing. His entire existence is Hashem. So therefore, Kashem Shemaisa Yadav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nitzchim Heim, just like what Hashem creates and fashions is eternal. Kain Gam Ma'aseh Yedei Moshe Eved Hashem. In like fashion, this is true about Moshe, who is the servant of Hashem and completely abnegated to Hashem. And we might say that this is why Hashem's actual resting his presence in the Mikdash was dafka in the merit of David HaMelech. K'moshe Amru Chazal, like Chazal explained in Gemara Shabbos, that it was only and specifically after Shlomo HaMelech davened to Hashem, Hashem Elokim al tashev pnei mishechecha zachra lechazdei David avdecha. Don't turn away your face. Remember the kindness of David, your servant. It was only after Shlomo Melech evoked his father and said to Hashem in the schus of David, your servant, it was only after that they were able to enter with the Aron, they were able to bring it into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and Hashem's Shechina came down. Because they had to affect the presence, the resting of Hashem's presence in an eternal way. So because they wanted to bring down the Shekhinah in an eternal fashion, the preparation for that had to happen through the agency of a person who was in the same mold, in the same category of Moshe Rabbeinu, a complete Evet to Hashem. And for that reason, Ma'aseh Yadav Kayamim La'elam. And therefore, what he touches, what he fashions, what he creates is eternal. So even though Shlomo HaMelech built the Beis HaMikdash, but in order for the Shekhinah to come down, for that he had to evoke David HaMelech. V'lechein haya hadavar b'schusei shel David. Shenyanahu Eved Hashem. And therefore, the Hashras HaShekhinah was in the schus of David because he's Eved Hashem. V'zeu shehit Shlomo b'tfilas hanal David avdecha. And the Rebbe says, and that's why when you look at the tefillah of Shlomo, what did Shlomo Melech say? So many things you could say about David Melech, but he said David avdecha, your servant. Umitzad zeh. And it was only because of this, and therefore our enemies were not able to actually reign over the eternity of the holiness of that spot. And this is like Moshe, who vested the components of the Mishkan with eternity. Ches. So based on the explanation given above, in describing the characteristic of resting, now we can explain why we would find the term menucha also used according to a different daya for Yerushalayim. And in fact, we find a verse in Tehillim that says, Bachar Hashem b'tzion. Hashem chose Tzion, which we know is another word for Yerushalayim. Zois menuchasi adead. In this pasuk, it says, this is my resting place. It doesn't say zu nachalasi, it's a zu menuchasi adead. Again, using that term, menucha. Dilach oira. It would seem it why would Yerushalayim, which is about permanence, be referred to as menuchasi, which has a temporary connotation? The Rebbe says, Ki b'mikdash hashlishi tiyena shtei hamayles. I always try to explain to people that the rest of the world calls this the post-temple era, but in our reality, this is the pre-temple era. And the Rebbe reminds us of that constantly, because in the third Beis HaMikdash, there will be both miles, both great characteristics. Hey nachala, the hey menucha. Both nachala, which connotes nitzchius, which connotes eternity, and menucha, complete rest. Nitzchiusai eina rak b'mokim hamikdash k'b'mikdash rishon v'sheni. In the third Beit Hamikdash, its eternity will not just be in terms of space, real estate, like it was for the first and second. Elagam habinyan atzmai inyan hamenucha yeloi kiyum nitzchi. The binyan itself will be eternal. After Hashem will build it by himself, for those of us who, you could close your eyes and remember the Rebbe saying these words emphatically so many times, that it will be the mikdash of Hashem that your hands will prepare. Hashem's hands will prepare. Like it's written in Isaiah, mikdash hashlisha yibaneh al yada de kuchabrichu yeh kayama l'darei darin. The third Beit Hamikdash will be built through the hands of Hashem, and it will exist until the end of time, for generations. Test. It would seem that we can ask a question about this. It would seem that the simple explanation of the words of this verse, this is my resting place forever, it would seem the Rebbe is trying to say that this is talking about the Mikdash HaShlishi. But the Rebbe says, but I have a question on my own on what I just told you. And that is that it would seem this is also talking about the first Beit HaMikdash, that pasuk. Even more. Harambam hevi kosov zeh kedam ledin. The Rambam brings down this pasuk to bolster the halacha that once the Beis Hamikdash was built in Yerushalayim, creating a house for Hashem is prohibited in any other place. So then it means it was for all time. But then again, the Rebbe is saying that the reason why you could say Zois Menuchasi on Yerushalayim is because it's talking about the third Beit Hamikdash. So how do we reconcile this? V'habir bazeh. And the explanation is, Al Chaniyas B'nei Yisrael b'midbar, regarding the resting stops that B'nai Yisrael took in the midbar, Isa b'gemar be'Reuven, it's written in the Gemara in Reuven, Kevan dechsiv, it says as follows, Bahu al pi Hashem, because it says there, al pi Hashem yachanu, al pi Hashem yisou, on the word of Hashem they rested, on the word of Hashem they traveled, then kaman dikvia luhu dami. This means it's considered permanent. It's considered bikvias. It's considered permanent. What does this mean? Even though Bnei Yisrael were in tents, they were a tent camp. They were, it would seem, for all intents and purposes, temporary. Hayusha einon kvuin. Hayu yeshve eilim. Hayu she'inon kvuin. But they were like permanent residents. Because once they're resting, even though it wasn't a tent, was al pi Hashem, was on the word of Hashem, then it's considered that they rest in permanent fashion. Their resting itself, even though they were in Ayhel, became something permanent. And so the same thing in the Mishkan and what we're talking about. Because Hashem called the Mikdash Bayis, before the Batei Mikdash were built, Hashem said, I will walk with you in a Ayel. That means that even the Batei Mikdash, which, okay, you'd say it's permanent because it's a bias, but it wasn't permanent. One time it stood for 400 and change, and one time again it stood for 400 and change. But the Rebbe says that because it was created al pi Hashem, so just like the Chaniyos in the Midbar, the Beis Hamikdash has a permanent aspect. Shegam Hamikdash ba'atzma ena lefisha. It's not temporary. Ela yesh bekein inin hamenucha. It has that idea of permanent calm and resting. Nidunas kva. It has status as something permanent. Umitam zeh hatoya menucha hoilam gam es hamikdash harishon hasheni. And therefore, it's appropriate that the term menucha should also relate to the Batei Mikdashes. Ki af al pi sheshleimus inyan hamenucha kafi shehi bechelke eklei hamishkan tieh rak b'mikdash hashlishi, because although the ultimate aspect of menucha, of permanence, of eternity, as it relates to the components and the kelim, will only be in the mikdash hashlishi. Aval me'ein zeh yesh gam b'mikdash harishon hasheni. But even the first two Batei Mikdash have some type of quality that is be'ein, that is a aspect or a subtle aspect of this. Ma'achar shenikru al pi Hashem bias, because they are called by Hashem bias. V'yesh leimar shezehu gam atam lekach shehachanas lebinyan beis hamikdash nasu al yedei David. And the Rebbe circles back and saying, and this, we could say, is the reason why the preparations for building the Beis Hamikdash. Earlier, the Rebbe talked about Shlomo HaMelech evoking his father's name when it came time to actually bring the Aron into the Beis Hamikdash. But now the Rebbe is saying that we might also understand that this is the reason why the seeds of building the Beis Hamikdash were actually planted by David HaMelech, Kimesupar Benach, like we learned, because what he would fashion would be eternal. So even though, as we've learned, David HaMelech was not able to build the Beis Hamikdash because his hands were bloodstained because of all the wars that he had to wage, but he actually created the he set the basis for it. And therefore, even the very structure had an eternal quality about it. But even so, so even though it had a aspect of eternity about it, but at the end it fell into the hands of the enemies, because the actual building project was through the agency of Shlomo HaMelech. It was only the preparatory stages that took place through David HaMelech. Yud. Le'il, above, in Seif Beis, in the second section of the Sikha, Huva Mashakosov b'Sifornai. The Rebbe brought down what the Siforna teaches, that one of the great characteristics of the Mishkan, for which reason it was deserving to be eternal, it was because it was a place where the luchais rested, because it was a place where the luchais rested. And just like there is a common feature of the Mishkan and the Mikdash Hashlishi, the third Beis Hamikdash, in terms of the revealed eternity shel hachalokim v'hakelim shebehem, of the components and the kelim. Kach yeshno tzad hashava behem gam besibas hanitzchi usam. In like fashion, is there a common denominator in the reason for their eternity? Shebeshvilam hayroy liyos nitzchi, and that is the reason that it was deserving to be eternal. And what is that? Asher bein b'mishkan, asher b'midbar, bein b'mikdash hashlishi, oimed ha'aron b'mkoimoi b'chol meshach zman kiyuma. Because both in the Mishkan And in the Mikdash Hashlishi, the Aron will stand in its place for the entirety of its existence. Masha Inkin, in contradistinction, B'Mikdasheni Milechatchila Haya Aron Chaser. In the second Beis Hamikdash, from the beginning, the Aron was never there. V'gam b'Mikdash Rishon b'Seif Manoi, and even at the end of the era of the first Beis Hamikdash, Gonza Yeshayahu already hid the Aron. And here, the Sikha really turns from like the Haskalah to the Avodah, from the from the learning, the theoretical to the Avodah. Nizbar le'il barucha shemailas hanitzchis yesh nagam b'mikdash rishon v'sheni. Rebbe says we explained above at length that the eternal quality that is ascribed to the components of the Mishkan and to the components of the third Beis Hamikdash also existed in some way in both Batei Mikdash. Ela shebehem haya kayemes beikor ubegoloi loy bekesher lechalkei Hamikdash ela benegei lahashras hashchina b'makam Hamikdash. In the Batei Mikdash, the eternal aspect manifested not in its components, but in its space. This means it's not the same type of eternity that there was in the Mishkan. Because in the Mishkan, because what's the novelty? That in the Mishkan, the physical components were vested with eternity. Whereas in the Mikdash, whereas when you're talking about the Batei Mikdash, you're talking on a spiritual level, there's an eternity, because the Shechina can never be obviated. And based on this, we have to say, Shemalas hanitzchis hanoisefes v'hamischadeshes al yedei ha'aron, that this characteristic, this eternal characteristic that is added and is novel and comes through the agency of the Aron, harehi loy hanitzchius haruchnius shel hashras hashchina ela davka hanitzchius hagashmis shebachalkei uklei hamishkan. Reb says that the eternity in the two, the Mishkan and the third Beis Hamikdash, somewhat, perhaps counterintuitively, the great attribute manifests dafka in the Gashmias and not in the Ruchnias. And we know in Chassidus over and over, we learned this, that the greatness of what the Gashmias manifests. I will understand this better by talking about what the Aron embodies in terms of our Avodas Hashem. Kol echad miyisrael harehu mishkan hu mikdash lo yizbarach. Each and every one of us is a mishkan and is a mikdash for Hashem. Kedivrei Razal hayeduim, like the very well-known words of our Chachamim on the pasuk va'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'soicham, not b'soichai, but b'soicham. Build me a mikdash and I will rest amongst you. B'soich kol echad v'echad, in each one of you. Ukashem shebamikdash yeshna shloisha diyurin, and just diyurin, I think. And just like in the mikdash, there are three areas. There's the azara, the courtyard. There's the kodesh, and then there's the kodesh hakadashim. Sheboy nimtza ha'aron, and it's in the kodesh hakadashim that the aron is found. Kach yeshnam shloisha diyurin elu b'mikdash haprati shebachol Yehudi. In like fashion, each one of us has these three spaces. Ha'azara, first there's the courtyard. Sheboy amad mizbeach hachitzon, what was found in the courtyard, the outer mizbeach, upon which were offered all of the animal sacrifices. But avoida, in terms of our avoida, harehi bechinas hachitzonius halev. This embodies the external aspect of the heart. The kodesh, sheboy niptza mizbeach hapnimi, the kodesh in which was found the golden altar upon which was offered the incense. Hu pnimius halev. This is the inner area of the heart. The kodesh hakadashim sheboy nimtza aron, And the Holy of Holies, which was found the Arein, who Pnimius de Pnimius Halev. This is the innermost aspect of the heart. And here, heart and neshama are actually being used in the same way. So the Rebbe says, this is the Yechida, Shebe Neshama. Bechina asher aleh ne'emar. This is the aspect about which it is says, Bavua de Bavua leis lahu. To this place, there is no parallel. Nothing can compare. And this aspect of the Jew is always complete. It's nitzchis, it's eternal. It is not possible that anything, look in parentheses, oivim, anything that is contra, anything that is an enemy, should reign over this aspect, v'yifkaba, and should be able to attack it or maim it or impact it in any way. Because even concerning much lower levels of the neshama, Ne'emar, the Alter Rebbe writes in the Tanya, the Gam b'shas hachet, that even when a Jew sins, the neshama is completely faithful to God. And we might say that this aspect of the pnim, pnimius halev, the yechida, he Moshe shebechol echad be'echad, is also the Moshe that is found in each one of us. Kashem sha'aron Torah hu inyan shel Moshe, like it says, Zichru Torahs Moshe Abdi, remember Zichru Torahs Moshe Abdi, remember the Torah of Moshe, my servant. And the Aron was in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and the Kodesh HaKadoshim is our Yechida. So the Rebbe says that's in of Moshe. And from this we can understand why in those two times in history, Zman HaMikdash, the time when we were in the Mishkan in the Midbar, and the time that is to come very, very shortly, Nimtza ha'aron b'mkaimai u'begoloi. The Aron is found in its place in a revealed fashion. The pnimius halev, the innermost part of our heart, the bechina of Yechida, the bechina of Moshe, in those times, in the Midbar, on the one hand, or in the time of the Mishkan, and very soon in the times of Beis HaMikdash, will be exposed. Dar HaMidbar HaYadar Deya. The Dar of the Midbar was called Dar Deya, the generation of knowledge. Kol Hadar HaYabdargas Shel Moshe Rabbeinu. The entire generation was in some way on the level of Moshe. Shinyanehu Das Elyon. Their entire life revolved around knowledge of the supernal. Kimabor b'chizvei Harizal, as Harizal explained. The Gam b'vias HaMashiach. And also when Mashiach comes, Bizman she'yikuyim hayiv gemal Hashem l'techas l'bavcha. The Gam HaKlipa Davka. About the time of Mashiach comes, the Torah says that Hashem will circumcise your heart. Even the most thin veneer will no longer remain. There'll be no impediment at all. And Tizgala Nekudas Primis Halev. And the innermost aspect of the heart, and the Pintala, Nekuda, the Pintala Yid, the innermost aspect, the Yechida, the Bechina of Moshe, will be revealed. Masha Inkain, besides Man Mikdash Rishon or B'chol Zman Mikdash Sheni. But when you compare and contrast this to the end part of the Mikdash Rishon and the entire time of the second Mikdash, even though the Aron was there completely, it didn't fall into the hand, it existed. And it was not in the hands of enemies, but it was obscured. It was hidden. Al pianal, if you'd base al pianal efshalabayas, based on what we've said above, we might explain b'pnimius hanyanim, on the innermost explanation. Mashadia karambam likreis hamishkan b'shem mikdash hamidbar. The Rebbe says, interestingly enough, the Rambam specifically calls the Mishkan Mikdash Hamidbar. Why? So the Rebbe says, Sharei Kiyadua, as is known, that Mirames Harambam Besifrei Kam in Yonum Shel Kabbalah, Valder Zubininu, that the Rambam hinted at inyonim of Kabbalah in his works. And here is one example in our inyan. Beloshen Mikdash Hamidbar. When you look at the term Mikdash Hamidbar, Mirumezes Hamayla Hanal Shebemishkan Sheboy Haya Arim Bimkaima Ubegoloi. In the term Midbar is alluded to this great characteristic of the Mishkan, which is embodied in the fact that the Aron was in its place constantly and it was revealed. He bepnimius de pnimius halev, he bechinas midbar. Because the innermost aspect of the heart of the neshama is called the midbar shebeneshama. What does this mean? So this is a paradigm shift because we're used to thinking of the midbar as a place that is desolate, that is empty, that is bereft. But the Rebbe says, but there's also another way of understanding it. Midbar shehi lamayla mifchinas adam shebeneshama. Midbar is a place that's even higher than the place that's called adam shebeneshama, where people traverse on a regular basis. It's a place lo yoshav adam sham. It's a place. So normally, when we talk about a place that's desolate, we say a no man's land. That's not a compliment. But the Rebbe says, Chassidus explains that there's a place in the neshama that's higher than man's land, than Adam, and that's midbar. Midbar l'maliyusa, using it in the positive sense. And what is that? Mesiras nefesh shelamayla mitam b'das. It's not a place where people are, meaning it's not a place where our normal calculations and where our seichel would take us. It's higher. It's a place of mesiras nefesh. It's higher than tam v'das. It's higher than logic. V'lachein matzinu gam b'mashiach b'chinas me'oid shelamayla mi'adam. And in like fashion, we find about Mashiach that there's this bechina, this aspect of me'oid, which is higher than the bechina, than the aspect of Adam. It says about Mashiach, Hine yaskil avdi yarum v'nasa v'gavoya ma'oid. The apprehension of my servant, speaking about Mashiach, is heightened and above and higher, ma'oid, much higher. Uma'oid, afal pisha ma'oid hu oisius adam, even though ma'oid is comprised of exactly the same letters of the word adam, but the way that the letters are strung together in the word ma'oid, this teaches about the aspect that is without any definition and without any limitation at all.
I'm not seeing the details.
Everybody could just mute themselves.
I'm gonna try to mute. Just give me a second.
Thank you so much, Sipa. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's not coming up on my screen. I'm gonna try again.
Thanks. So this is a place that's Lamaila Mitziruf Adam. It's higher than a place that is encapsulated in the term Adam. When the letters Aleph, Daled, and Mem are strung together to make Adam. No, this is Ma'oid, Mem, Aleph, Daled. This is a place that's higher. That's the Midbar de Kedusha. This is the desert of holiness that is above the thoroughfare of human beings with all of our calculations and our logic and our ruminations and our postulations, etc., etc. Shekain zuhi dagas arin sheyuchzar alidei Mashiach l'mkoyim b'galoi. Because this is the level of the arin that will be returned through Mashiach to its place in a revealed fashion. And in closing, the Rebbe says, Yadua she'adam meira al shloish habachines. And it's well known in the Kutei Torah, the Rebbe teaches that Adam teaches concerning the three aspects of the persona, machshava, dibur, and maisa, our thought, our speech, and our actions. The aleph alludes to machshava because the beginning of everything is the thought process. Dalet is for dibor, speech, and mem is for maisa, for action. And so based on this, we find that when we look at the level of me'oid, which is higher than the level of Adam, what's the beginning? Not the Aleph, which is usually the beginning. Because on the level of Adam, on the level of our human construct, everything begins with machshava. Now the Rebbe is teaching us something so amazing that when you come to the level of Ma'od, transcendent, there it all begins with Maisa. And here I have to break for a moment to say something personal to Sarah Hecht, who was Sarah Deitch, who was last week, the Sikha was kind of like difficult. So I just want to say that your student, Sarah Dillon, who transferred from your husband's tefillin on Friday and your food and your pasta and the kasha that you gave him, landed in Binghamton and did not last here very long. He is now in Morristown, New Jersey.
Learning.
His name is Shalom, not Dylan. So you and your husband should have enormous Hasidic shenachas from him and from all of your Talmidim and Talmidais. And this is the Bechina of Maisa, of the Mem of Me'oid.
Thank you, Rivky.
But we need both. We need the Adam and we need the Me'oid. V'habir bazeh, an explanation. Inyan ha-mesiras nefesh bo l'dei bitui dafka b'inyan ha-maisa. Because mesiras nefesh comes to expression dafka through action. The na'ot tchilasan b'seifan dafka. Because we learn Kabbalah, Hasidus, that the beginning is always wedged in the end. So while maisa would seem to be the end, but really the beginning, the most profound, is wedged in the end. And this is what Hasidus explains on the words, so the conventional understanding is, there is nothing like you in this world. There's nothing, there's nothing that holds a candle to you. There's nothing that's worthy in this world. But Hasidus explains that it is specifically in this world, in the physical, material, corporeal world, that is where the stupendous, and I mean, what words can we possibly say about Hashem? But that is dafka where the greatness Ein Arich actually comes to the fore. And this is also true about the Ein Arich that is in every Jew, the aspect of every Jew that cannot be qualified, it cannot be quantified. There is nothing that comes close to it. This is the kayach of Mesiras Nefesh, of self-sacrifice, that is nestled in the innermost aspect of every heart. Ein Arich. This is in the Ein Arich of the neshama. This is in the part of the neshama that there's nothing that can be compared to it. And it comes and it comes to expression specifically through action. And this is the explanation between the two things that we find that are superlative about the Mishkan and the Mikdash HaShlishi. The Arayin, that the Arayin was always there in manifest way in its place, and that the Chelek Mishkan or Mikdash Hagashmim Hem Nitzchim, and that the components of both the Mishkan and the Mikdash, the physical components, are eternal. Ke'inyan ha'Arayin, because the Inyan of the Arayin, Pnimius de Pnimius Halev, which is the embodiment of the deepest part of our heart, Misbate Dafka B'inyan Hasiya, is expressed specifically in action or in the physical dimension. Benitzchias hagashmi shel chelkei uklei hamishkan v'hamikdash. In the eternity of the material components and aspects of the Mishkan and the Mikdash. So I'm going to now ask Tzippa to unmute herself, but I just want to wish everybody, this is Shabbos Chazak coming up, Chazak, Chazak, we should be strengthened, and Thursday and Friday, Rosh Chodesh Adar Beis, and all of the brachas that flow, and we should see the simcha of Adar for all of us personally and for all of us collectively. And in that vein, Tzippa will lead us into Hillim and Staka.
Hi, I wanted just to do a screen share. Thank you so much, Rivky. I guess first everyone could give tzedakah. You have a coin nearby. I just wanted to do a screen share with the Kapitel. So if we can all say it together. Lam Natseach, Mizmor, the David, Yancha, Adonai, Biyom, Sarah, Yisagecha, Shem Elohei Yaakov, Yishlach, Ezracha, Mekadesh, Umetzion, Yisadecha, Yizkor, Kol, Minchasecha, Ve'olascha, Gidashna Sela, Yiten Lecha, Kilvavecha, Bekol, Atatzcha Yimale, Niranana, Yeshuasecha, Ubeshem, Eloheinu Nigdol, Yimale, Adonai, Kol, Mishlotecha, Ata Yadati Ki Hoshia, Adonai, Mishicho, Yanehu, Nishmei Kajo Beguros Yeshe Yemino. Ela Varecha Ve'ela Vasusim Ve'anachnu B'Shem Adonai Eloheinu Nazkir. Hama Karu Ve'nachlu Ve'anachnu Kamnu Ve'nisodad Adonai Hoshia Hamel Yanenu B'Yom Karenu.
Thank you, Tzippa. The Eibusher should be makabel all of our tefillas and everything that we're doing, and bring shalom al Yisrael and bring shalom on that whole region and the whole world.
Amen.
Wishing everybody a wonderful week.
Thank you, Rivky.
Thank you, Tzippa.
Thank you.